I should especially salute people who have joined online, whom I always forget. You are always the what is called excluded group whenever I welcome people. So first, I would like to welcome those who have joined online. Uh, Dr. Surajit Das, some of the friends of GIFT who joined from outside, of course, my colleagues and students. We are going to listen to Dr. Surajit Das on a very contemporary issue, which is very close to the hearts of many in GIFT. And it is also becoming an issue of much relevance for our policymakers, particularly because we are at a juncture wherein the 16th Finance Commission has been appointed, and we are a country wherein the states do much of the heavy lifting in terms of discharging responsibilities, while the union takes much of the heavy lifting in terms of collecting money. So that discrepancy is there. With that, we have only one option, either to steal, which we can't steal. We have, so states go for borrowing. Even that is now constrained because the constitutionally given entitlement of borrowing 3.5%, that has been constrained by the union. That is what actually led the government of Kerala to go to the Supreme Court at the first of its kind episode in the Indian history. Since another option is, if we don't get borrowing, another option is Finance Commission devolution. So Finance Commission uses all kinds of criteria. Some of them are age-old criteria. As old is not always gold and good. Some old is really bad. That's what we were actually thinking. We need to change. And Finance Commission, with all our respect for Finance Commissions, they have done a remarkable job. Even to the extent of holding India together, their job has been remarkable. But they could be a little bit more what is called responsive to the changes in the economy. So it is in this context that Dr. Surajit Das's paper here, the seminar here, discussing on fiscal space for financing human development in India seems very important. I am not here to talk either about the topic nor about the person, because as I often say, in the world of Google and Siri, none can introduce someone more than these two. Then if I cannot beat Siri and Google on that. But except, I mean, because again, I have to say something. So in that sense, if you ask me to say in 3 sentences, first I would say that Surajit Das is not a Bengali, he's actually Malayali. So that is point number one. His first job, not first job, he worked with Kerala State Planning Board. Of course, before that, he had his association with Planning Commission. Also, he also worked with Ambedkar University. He also had worked with the two associated with the two finance commissions. And now, as you know, he's now working in Jawaharlal Nehru University. And his areas of interest are very much relevant for us. And he has worked on public finance broadly area and also specifically on GST. Yes, probably. In fact, I really liked your article. In fact, I have stolen a few sentences from that. I also cited you. I think we are very happy that you are here, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I remember there is yesterday he came for a discussion in CDS. And last time, one of my friends who came over there for delivering a lecture, I invited here. Then he told they paid their fare and he is taking the advantage. So this is not that. Next time I will invite you. Okay, then you can give a seminar there. Okay. Before you saying that, better I say it. So on behalf of all of us online and offline, we most warmly welcome you. And I appreciate my coordinators for getting it arranged. Thank you and I welcome you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot. In fact, thank you for giving me this opportunity and inviting me here. I met Kiran in ISLE conference in Hyderabad, and he asked me about this, and I was glad to accept the proposal because I have just started working on this particular topic. So I thought it's a good opportunity to present it in an institute like GIFT, where there are many specialists. I can get some comments, some useful questions, and so on. So I look forward. Sir, how much time do I have?
You can take any amount of time so long as you don't exceed 40 minutes. 40 is enough.
Yeah, 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 more than enough. Yes, yes. So I would straight away go to my slides. Uh, can we move it little? Okay.
Yeah, this, yeah, that's.
Oh, it's coming anyway.
Position.
Okay. Oh, great, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So today's topic of discussion is fiscal space for financing human development in India. Now, just to set the context, let me begin by saying that in 2004, when UPA one government came in power at the center, union government, uh, there was one common minimum program drafted where uh, we resolved that the expenditure on education should be 6% of GDP, expenditure on health should be 3% of GDP, of course, combined expenditure, including central government and state government expenditures. Uh, During that time, our education expenditure to GDP ratio, I used to track Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan from NIPFP in those days, so I remember, was little less than 3% of GDP. Even today, it is around 2.8% of GDP or so. And health expenditure, excluding water supply and sanitation, was something like little less than 1% of GDP. Even now, it is around 1% of GDP. During COVID year, I think it increased little bit because of vaccination, etc. But otherwise, it's around that. Interestingly, uh, in I was checking international data in 99 2000 in China, the health expenditure was something around 1% of GDP. Now they have increased it to more than 3% of GDP. And in human development related indicators have shown that China has is one of the countries which has made enormous improvement vis-a-vis human development indicators. Of course, there are questions about their data and everything, but at the same time, even international data sources are showing that there have been substantial improvement, and China is also a big country like ours. So population wise, it's more or less comparable. So it's a remarkable achievement. And my other research, in fact, for last 5 years, I am working on these things in this area, that fiscal policy for human development. So I mean, I have run some regressions, etc. I do time series econometrics, but I'm not going to show those regression results here. I mean, the empirical evidences suggest that even Amartya Sen has said that government thinks that they can do a lot of things, but actually they can successfully do very few things. Education and health, these sectors, social sector expenditure is one of them, which has a very close connection, statistically significant connection with the improvement in health and educational indicators, human development indicators. Therefore, this is one area where government can do something. Kerala is one of the biggest examples that if government is sincerely in the medium run tries for improving education health sectors to a great extent, I mean, of nothing is foolproof, but to a great extent, they can achieve. Now, when this question comes, then I am not a fiscal conservative, conservative person. I don't believe that under a demand constraint situation, in the presence of huge informal economy, it is always true that whenever there would be an increase in fiscal deficit, there would be either crowding out of private investment or it would be inflationary and so on. However, expansionary fiscal policy is possible. To what extent, how much we go about it and all, there could be debates regarding that. Whether uh, 6% of GDP, 3 plus 3, or whether it should be 10% or I don't know, 7%, 15%. Regarding that, I don't have a clear idea, but I am not in favor of sound finance and balanced budget, particularly under demand constraint situation. So this today's presentation should not be looked in a way that I am telling that to increase social sector expenditure, uh, there must be some expenditure rationalization in some other front. I mean, it may look like that. So we can always expand, but what I am trying to argue today is that within our, given the amount of fiscal deficit that we are currently having, there are spaces where government can do some work in order to make some fiscal space free, substantial fiscal space free for education and health expenditure in India. And it is particularly true for the state governments because human development is largely a state subject. Central government is spending some money through CSSs, but that would be less than 20%. 80% of the expenditure on health and education have to be borne by the state government. So for state exchequers, it is particularly important in my view. Okay. Now, there was a lot of discussion about G20, etc. So I also was invited to speak in Delhi in a conference on G20. So I made this chart there that if we plot the government health expenditure as proportion of GDP of G20 countries, uh, Germany, United States, they are spending more than 9%, Japan, and we spend around 1% of GDP, which I was mentioning. So, I mean, as far as G20 is concerned, uh, yeah, we are spending the lowest. And this is average of 2018, 19, and 20, and the data source is World Bank, World Development Indicators. Then next chart is very similar. This is also WDI data. I have plotted the all major country groups around the world. All major country groups. Obviously, we know that OECD countries and European countries, they spend very high on health, more than 7% of their GDP. As compared to that, we are spending 1% of GDP. And on an average, if we look at the world, the average expenditure on health as proportion of GDP is roughly around 3%. So elsewhere, in most part of the world, 3% of government, 3% of GDP amount of government expenditure goes into the health sector. Of course, the health model varies widely country to country. Some are going for more direct approach, some are going for insurance-based approach, some are going for, so that varies. But as far as total or presence of government in the health sector is concerned, it's around 3% of GDP in most part of the world. And here it is 1%. So, sorry, centers together, of course, combined, government, general government. By government, in fact, I think, maybe later on I'll come back to this question. In case of Kerala, it is surprising that after mid 90s, after 97 or 98, I think that decentralization, there's a break, and the expenditure, state government expenditure on health and education shows a decline. But a lot of money gets devolved to the local bodies, so that also has to be added and so on. But here it is general government. By general government, World Bank, the way it compiles the data, it tries to compile all layers of government, union, provincial, as well as local bodies. Okay. Now, this is similar graph vis-a-vis the education expenditure. Here it is 2.85% in India, 2.85% of GDP, as compared to most of the G20 countries. It is the lowest. Saudi Arabia of late is spending huge, more than 7% of GDP on education. And many countries like Brazil and South Africa, they are developing countries, but they are also spending a lot of money, 6% of GDP on education. And we are still spending less than 3% of GDP on education. And this is again similar graph vis-a-vis education expenditure to GDP ratio. Uh, I mean, we spend 2.8% or so, but maximum country groups are spending more than almost 5% and so on. Okay. So, yeah. Now, given these things, okay, one more. This table is nothing but this. I have plotted health expenditure to GDP ratio, education expenditure to GDP ratio of G20 countries, and I have combined them, health plus education to GDP ratio. That is the last column. And if we plot a scattered diagram taking Human Development Index of 2021 along the vertical axis and the health plus education expenditure to GDP ratio along the horizontal axis, then clearly there is a positive correlation, and it is quite statistically significant. With, I mean, this is simple bivariate plot gives you 70% R square. So 70% of the variation in human development index of these G20 countries can be explained only by one indicator, which is the government expenditure on social sector to GDP ratio. So, I mean, I was talking about those regressions. I mean, we can go for sophisticated regressions also, taking data of 160 countries around the world. We tried to see. You have to put some continent-specific dummies and all, but and some after some adjustments, it is possible to show that almost 90% of the country-to-country variation in Human Development Index can be explained only by government expenditure to GDP ratio, or particularly government expenditure in social sector as proportion of GDP. So there are ample evidences available worldwide that government expenditure in social sector, health, education matters in improving Human Development Index, which is, of course, UNDP HDI is constituted of health indicator, education indicator, and the per capita income, per capita GDP. So if we control for that per capita in GDP, that is, richer country would do better, poorer countries would do are expected to do relatively worse. But even if we control for the impact of per capita GDP on Human Development Index, the role of government expenditure in social sector as proportion of GDP on the after controlling for the effect of per capita GDP, the effect of government expenditure to GDP ratio on Human Development Index is extremely high. Is extremely high. So empirical evidence suggests that we need to spend more money on education and health, particularly given the huge gaps, social sector gaps that we have in most part of the country. Now the question comes that where from the money come? I mean, all other expenditures are also important. I mean, we cannot cut down expenditure on whatever defense, or everything is important for maybe non-developmental, but they are also important for their own reasons. So it is difficult to cut down expenditures from some other. I mean, one possibility is, of course, we can improve tax GDP ratio. Tax to GDP ratio is extremely low. I mean, there is more or less a consensus in this country among the public finance experts that our tax GDP tax, including non-tax and tax GDP ratio, Professor Pulin Naik used to tell us this story that of Delhi School of Economics, that our tax to GDP ratio is roughly 16 to 17% of GDP, combined tax to GDP ratio, which is 1/6 of the produce. If you convert it into 1/6, and Kautilya Chanakya apparently 2500 years ago told that one-sixth of the produce should be ideally collected as tax. Of course, that time it was yeah, mostly agrarian society, and that way, if the king taxes too much, the poor farmers would die and the production would not be viable, and that kind of logic was there. But whatever, till today, our tax GDP ratio is around that one-sixth or 16-17%. So in most of the countries, revenue GDP ratio has been increased to around 30% of GDP. In Europe, etc., it is almost 50% of GDP, 45 to 50% of GDP. However, in this country, it is less than 20% or around 20% of GDP tax plus non-tax revenue to GDP ratio. On top of that, we have 6 to 7% fiscal deficit of the combined government. That way, our expenditure to GDP ratio comes to around 26-27% of GDP. That's the broad picture of public finance in this country. So, I mean, there are scopes for improving tax GDP ratio, not by increasing the tax rates. Tax rates, both of direct as well as indirect taxes, tax rates are not low in this country. It is not on the higher side, but if we look at the world over data, generally it is on the somewhere around the average. Even our indirect tax rates, GST rates, it's 18%, the major rate. I was looking at GST data all over the world. It varies in most part of there are exceptions, few exceptions, but most countries it varies between 16 to 20%. And in this country, it is 18%. So we have had thousands of workshops and seminars in this country to decide what would be revenue neutral rates. Sir was talking about my GST paper. That time I was in NIPFP. Kavita Di was telling 28%. Pinakida has said the 23%. That time Kelkar Sab gave some 12%. So then finally 18%. But now I see world over it is between 16 to 18, 16 to 20%. And in this country it is around 18%. So there is some other logic also probably which we are missing somewhere or which we are failing to understand probably. Anyway, but our tax GDP tax rates are not very low, but tax GDP ratio is extremely low. There are a lot of scopes for improvement vis-a-vis the compliance by improving the efficiency of tax collecting authority, by improving the tax information network of the country, by improving by reducing the degree of corruption. And also we have to remember that it is privately funded political system that we have in this country. So how to, under that circumstances, how to calculate this possible potential size of the exchequer, etc. That is also another challenging task. All those things are there, but tax GDP ratio can go up at least to some extent. Uh, it is also true that fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, if required, if it is for social sector expenditure or investment in human development, then it can, to some extent, it can surely go up. I am not against that. Uh, However, uh, the given the limitations of tax collecting authority or whatever, given the compliance, as of now, the tax GDP ratio is around 20% of GDP. The fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is 6 to 7% of GDP. I mean, in abnormal, which is one of the highest in the world, by the way. I mean, including central. I met one Pakistani economist, and he was saying that all over the globe, when IMF was propagating this 3% norm, following the Maastricht Treaty of European Union, and here we somehow could manage to convince them that state government should have autonomy and 3 plus 3, so if not 6, but 5.6% of GDP and so on. So Pakistani fellow was asking, Janab, how could you do this? Because they are also constrained by this 3%, and all over the globe. In fact, Williamson came and wrote in EPW that 3% thing was proposed in Washington Consensus, keeping in mind some of the Latin American countries in 80s. In 89, I think Washington consensus took place. And in 1992, this Maastricht Treaty was signed, because in most of the European countries in those days, the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio was either little lower or little higher than 3%. So they all agreed upon this 3%. Then IMF started propagating it all over the globe, and we borrowed the idea. So that way it was. But that is a point. However, our fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is also not one of the lowest in the whole world. In fact, one of the highest. It's not even average, it's one of the highest. However, most of this fiscal deficit is being spent on interest payment. In this particular plot, uh, I have plotted fiscal deficit and primary deficit and interest payment as proportion of GDP. Fiscal deficit is equal to primary deficit plus interest payment. So if you look at the primary deficit, which is the lower panel, our during COVID time 2019-20, it has gone up little bit. Otherwise, our primary deficit to GDP ratio is not very high. Our fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is very high, which crossed 12% during COVID year. But on an average, it is around 8% or so. So, and our primary deficit to GDP ratio is around 2%. So around 6%, 5 to 6% of GDP is going behind interest payment. That is, that thick continuous line is interest payment to GDP ratio, which was below 3% during early 1990s, which has continuously gone up, and particularly after 1997 there is a rise, and it has now crossed the 5% of GDP, which is quite substantial. It is, in fact, this graph shows that interest payment to GDP ratio is higher than the combined health and education expenditure of the central and state governments in this country. So interest payment component, this dotted line, the upper panel, the continuous thick line here is the capital expenditure to GDP ratio of the combined government, including central and state governments. So interest payment to GDP ratio has become higher than the capital expenditure of central and state government, combined capital expenditure to GDP ratio, and also uh, combined expenditure on social sector as proportion of GDP. I mean, not social sector, let's say health and education as proportion of GDP. So it is quite something. Now, why is it? Okay. Now, I wanted to compare it with the international situation. As far as the international situation is concerned, I have taken average of 43 advanced economies, 95 emerging market and middle income economies, and 58 low income developing economies. So if you look at, and the upper thick panel is India. That is interest payment as proportion of GDP. As I was saying, that it has crossed 5% of GDP now. So if we look at the worldwide evidence, of all kinds of countries, the averages, there are some countries around near our some of our neighbors, their interest payment to GDP ratio is also high, but nobody is paying, on an average, nobody is paying more than 2% of GDP on debt servicing. The On an average, developing countries, advanced countries, middle income countries, everybody is paying something between 1 to 2% of GDP for debt servicing. But we are paying more than 5% of GDP on interest payment. Now, if this is the same graph, instead of as proportion of GDP, what I have done is I have taken as proportion of aggregate government expenditure. But here also the advanced country average and middle income and developing country averages are much lower as compared to the interest payment as percentage of aggregate government expenditure here in India. Which is taking away almost 17% of our, that is one sixth of our budget, total government expenditure of the central and state government, which is quite substantial. So yeah, now I was looking at what is the problem. The problem lies probably here, that is our effective interest rate on public debt. 1991 to 2021 I have plotted this effective interest rate on public debt, that is again thick line upper panel. that is continuously going up from 4%, around 4% in early 90s, to after 1997, it has increased continuously, and it has gone up to almost 7%, more than 6.5% to 7%. Off late in the recent past, in 2021, it came down a little bit, but now again it is rising. So, and as compared to that, both in case of advanced countries as well as in the case of emerging middle income countries, the effective interest rate on government securities are continuously coming down. They are continuously coming down over time. For developing for low income countries, for low income developing countries, it is rising, but even after rise, it has reached somewhere around 4%, which was the effective interest rate for India in early 90s. And now our interest rate has become almost like 7% as compared to uh, the other country averages, which are either 4% or lower than that. And more importantly, it is continuously rising in case of India after 1997, and for other countries, for advanced and middle income countries, it is coming down. So yeah, so this is a cause of concern. I'll speak a bit about why it has happened and how it has happened. What happened in 1997, that is also the structural break. And because of that policy decision, we are suffering from this high interest rate on the government securities for last more than more than 15 years or so. So, no, sorry, more than 25 years or so. Yeah. Now, this table, I was saying today morning, I was preparing. So this is from the Kerala budget. Since I'm presenting here, I thought there should be one slide on Kerala. So in case of Kerala, the effective interest rate, this is from budget at a glance of this year, 24-25. Kerala, on Kerala's accumulated liabilities, government liabilities, the effective interest rate, I have just calculated this morning, is around 7%, 6.94%, 6.95% in 2022-23, and 23-24, although it is revised estimate, 6.7% or so. So around 7%. Hmm? Yeah, so Kerala is also paying interest at a rate of around 7% per annum. Interest payment as proportion of GSDP is that is the difference between fiscal deficit to GSDP ratio and the primary deficit to GSDP ratio. So that is around 2.5% in 21-22, 2.4% in 22-23, to 23-24, it is expected to be 2.3% or so, which means in 21-22, 33.87% of the budget, so 33.87% of the total revenue receipt, own revenue receipt, that is own tax revenue plus non-tax revenue of Kerala, 33%, one third of that is going just for interest payment. So that is a really cause. Off late it has come down a little bit, but still it is 29% or so. So almost around 30% of the own revenue receipt, tax and non-tax of the government of Kerala, state government of Kerala, is going for debt servicing. Then yeah, and as proportion of budget, it is, as I was saying, around 15% or 15-16% or so. So this is the situation in most of the states, including Kerala. Now, and also for the union government. So together, state government is around 2.5% or so. Yeah, 2.5%, and central governments, union governments, debt servicing cost is also something around 2.5% of GDP. So together, they are becoming 5% of GDP. So that's the story. Now, I was talking about what happened in 1997. 1997, this RBI, Reserve Bank of India, that time Professor Rangarajan was the chairperson of Reserve Bank of India, and Ministry of Finance, they signed one memorandum of understanding by which they have done away with the process of monetization of signage or direct borrowing of government from the RBI or from its own central bank. Now, I got opportunities to work with Professor Rangarajan, and I asked him once, and he was saying that earlier the practice was that whatever would be the fiscal deficit, there would be automatic monetization. So earlier there was no restriction anywhere. So whatever there would be excess, if there is excess expenditure on the part of central or state governments, it would be automatically monetized. So in order to stop that, this MOU was signed, and for also for central bank autonomy and so on. However, that was one extreme, but now the situation has become like I was calculating our Reserve Bank of India right now is sitting over a huge foreign exchange reserve of $600 billion. Okay, they are also making investment, and on that investment, they earn on an average something around 2% per annum. And government, on the other hand, is borrowing from the commercial banks and other domestic commercial at almost 7% per annum. So if government borrows from the RBI at let's say anything above 2% per annum, RBI would also be happy, and government can substantially reduce the cost of debt servicing through restructuring of debt. Now, uh, so this MOU is coming in the way. This MOU is signed between Ministry of Finance and the RBI. Now, Professor Rangarajan himself came back during this crisis, COVID-19 lockdown, and okay, before that, encasing committee, FRBM review committee, they said that in emergency situation, government should be allowed to borrow from its own central bank occasionally. And Professor Rangarajan himself, wrote in public domain on record that monetization is probably is the need of the hour. So when there was very high fiscal deficit, but at the same time there was a huge crisis and employment crisis and demand depression and so on. So monetization. In fact, Calcutta-based economist Professor Mihir Rakshit, he once argued in EPW that it is a free lunch in the context of a country like ours, where there is huge informal sector and huge absorption capacity, huge lack of demand on the part of majority of the population. Possibly any demand injection in the form of higher fiscal deficit financed by monetization or borrowing from the central bank would not necessarily cause inflation or would not necessarily cause crowding out of private investment and so on. So even Professor Abhijit Sen was of the opinion that given the informality, we have a lot of absorption capacity and so on. That was the thing. Now, the point is this high rate of interest is going where, or who all are owning the government debt in India? As far as ownership of government securities in India, I have clubbed together central government, state government, and also dated securities as well as the treasury bills. So combining all these, we can see that 37% is going to the commercial banks. 37% of the securities are held by commercial banks, including foreign commercial banks and private commercial banks, not only nationalized commercial banks. 25% is owned by the insurance companies. So total around 62% of the securities are being held by the commercial banks and the insurance companies. 15% is for the provident funds and pension funds and etc. And others, including cooperative banks and mutual funds, non-banking financial corporations, and foreign portfolio investors, including corporate houses, they own something around 14%, and 9% is of the papers are still held by the Reserve Bank of India. So this 9% is effective monetization or borrowing from the central bank, and the rest is not. This is the present composition of the ownership of government securities in India. So this high rate of interest, almost 7%, is basically going to the commercial sector, commercial banking sector and the insurance sector, and also to some extent to the corporate houses and NBFCs, mutual funds, cooperative banks, and so on. So that is useful. That is, I'm not saying that, that is giving some kind of support to the commercial banking sector and insurance sector of the country. Now, whether it is justified or not, whether they are heavily subsidized or not, there could be debates about that. But commercial banking sector or insurance sectors in this country, at least, are not operating independently based on the market forces. Clearly they are heavily indirectly subsidized. They are getting the benefits of this high rate of interest on the government bonds, and government, instead of choosing RBI to borrow from, they are choosing commercial banks and insurance companies to borrow from at a very high rate of interest. In government, as far as government bond market in India is concerned, that is also not operating through demand supply mechanism. We all know that there are primary dealers through which it is operated, so it is also administered, heavily administered. So that way, government bond market is not freely operating the way we think that demand for government bond and so. Anyway, demand for government bond cannot fall, because until and unless people have faith on money, which is guaranteed by the same sovereign authority, why would people, have less faith on government bonds, which is issued by the same sovereign authority, and which fetches some interest also? Money, cash doesn't fetch any interest, but money fetches, bonds fetch interest also. So there is no reason to believe that government bonds, the credit rating of the government bonds would come down if there is higher supply of government bonds. So this is the scenario in which I am trying to argue that if the effect after restructuring of government debt, if the effective rate of interest on government securities can come down substantially from, let's say, 7% of 7% per annum to 3 to 4% per annum, then we can possibly save, and our interest payment to GDP ratio can come down from, let's say, 5% of GDP to around 2% of GDP or so, which is happening in the case of all other countries around the world. Then around 3% of GDP amount of fiscal space can be freed for enhancing expenditure either in social sector or in infrastructure and so on. And when I talk about 3% of GDP, that is quite substantial. That means something around 10 lakh crore rupees. So it's quite substantial, and that fiscal space, it's a matter of priority. I am not saying that it is being wasted. It is being utilized in order to provide support to the commercial banking sector and the insurance companies right now, and to some extent corporate sector and FPIs and pension and these provident funds. However, that is happening at the cost of extremely low expenditure on infrastructure and on social sector, health and education and so on. So uh, uh, I mean, that's what I'm trying to suggest, that possibly there are some rooms for expenditure rationalization and taking out some money from this interest payment component by restructuring the debt, by slowly borrowing more from the RBI and less from the commercial banks and the insurance sector. And possibly that may give us some room, along with expansionary fiscal policy and improving in tax compliance and so on, to spend more on health, education, and employment generation, poverty alleviation in this country. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think you made such an insightful recommendation, very relevant. I can take could have taken a few more minutes, in fact. Okay, thank you very much. It is a wonderful presentation. I think you have articulated, I think, remarkably well where we in India stand with respect to human development, which I would call what is called the fundamental in a knowledge economy of the type that we are living in, where knowledge is the key resource and no more your oil. And learning is the most important process, no more manufacturing. And without human capital, you cannot think in terms of delving into this wonderful area. And where we are actually, we are having such an abysmal position. We are talking about 1% as compared to Germany or global 3%. Very poor expenditure in terms of input measure. You argued that, and you well articulated that this is you have a problem. Where do you find the money for it? So you are actually presenting a scenario wherein you are spending so much on interest. And Kerala is not bad. And you got very cleverly, very intelligently, very analytically, you got into the fiscal management of the government, which is actually trying to discipline everyone else. And you argued that you are doing such an incompetent job. If you can do it properly, you can release so much resources, which could be used for this, which you love to use for that, or you can use for election fund or whatever. If you like them to used for human capital. I think very well articulated, piece. I'm sure very interesting paper, and I think I think the floor should be open for discussion. You. Yeah, we can start online because some people would have felt, I think some people, they want to take some more time to ask questions. That's why you're asking. I think, this buying some time. Okay, let online start. I think this is a very intelligent move, I suppose. But anyway, I think let me start from my side to begin with. I would say that when you were talking about China, I cannot agree with you more. In fact, when I joined here, it was immediately after 3 years of my assignment to China. Then I was praising about China. All my colleagues got really angry with me. But I know that China, even if the data is bad, they have done, I would say that while we were in a group of Americans, they said, I think they are doing, the data is underestimated, they said. In fact, Kiran and we were together moving in Tianjin, and the manner in which the place is built, we thought the per capita income is maybe a gross underestimate. Actually, it is more. So, but when we are talking about India's this 1%, you have an implicit assumption that all what is happening in health and education is only government. And we are living in a world where its government is increasingly taking off its hands from the steering of this important thing. And you are leaving it to public, to private. In fact, in Kerala, I would argue that our Manappuram or health, all these Sahadullahs and all, they are doing remarkably, Asad Mupan, they are all doing remarkably well. And can we argue that this 1% is a true reflection of actually Kerala, India is, and but China, it's only, this is something which one has to be, I was actually thinking that, where somebody who is, okay, I think I would rather, before people online leaving, they should be given a chance. And I think floor is open to important friends in online. You may please start question, I suppose. Over to you. Yeah. Hello, those who are online, you can, the floor is open for you to begin with. So, okay, I think by the time they prepare, I think we will keep the floor open here. Yeah. Pardon? So there's a hand over there with gift hard room. Okay, fine. Okay, fine. The floor is open here. Right.
So,
Ritvik, yeah, this is.
So I have just one clarification question, that you have emphasized on the large chunk of informal economy. So the expansionary fiscal policy can be used and it won't affect in inflation or something, because there is much aggregate demand and all. And I have read in Raja Chalaya's book recently, and he much more emphasizes that our problem is not on aggregate demand. Actually, the production bottlenecks in our country, and government is actively getting away from the production process and all. So, could you please explain how that the informal sector plays a huge role uh, regarding the expansionary thing which government does? Uh, uh, that's the question. And also one more thing, uh, uh, you have said that after 90s and all, state expenditure in Kerala, especially Kerala's expenditure on health has decreased over time. So, can we say that the government expenditure alone can make differences in public infrastructure of health? Because decentralization also should go along with that, right? Otherwise, uh, that's a thing I should ask. Yeah.
Hi, sir. It was really an interesting presentation and the interesting findings that you have put forwarded. Uh, right from the East Asian miracle, all the nations have been concentrating on heavy investments on human development. And what happened afterwards, we have this twin deficit problem and everyone concentrated on the fiscal consolidation thing. And then we know that from Kotari Commission onwards, we have that rhetoric of 6% spending, 6% of GDP setting apart for education, but that never happened. Even the recent new education policy also emphasized on the same thing. So my point is, instead of heavily focusing on the quantity of expenditure, you have the fiscal space constraint. Even if you have some free fiscal space coming out of the restructuring and all those monetization efforts that you have mentioned, still we have constrained fiscal space. So in that case, why don't we make an effort for concentrating on or focusing on the quality of social sector expenditure instead of giving more thrust on the quantity?
So, Sujit, it's very nice presentation. Yes, I think it is a timely one. I have two questions. One is regarding the rate of tax. You already mentioned that the rate of tax is moderate compared to the developed or other countries in India, especially in the GST scenario, 18%. But when you compare with the pre-GST regime, this is not revenue neutral because earlier it was 22, 23 like that, especially for Kerala. We have suffered a lot because of that thing. So that argument has to be considered. That's one thing. And the second question is you mentioned that by borrowing from RBI, we can get a very, at a low interest rate, we can borrow from RBI. But is the state government can do anything for that? From where it has to come? Or the parliament or no? By in which way we will, you know, put forward the thing? That is that initiative has to come from the central government. Or that is another thing. Yeah, I think that's two questions.
I have one question. You have mentioned about the Master Treaty, 1992 onwards, the countries started following Master Treaty. And so India's stand on Master Treaty, people interpret in different ways. For example, mostly we are considering that our fiscal deficit target has been fixed because of the Master Treaty and all. It's one way of version. And I often ask two people, I mean, those who were there at the time of planning. So the same question, whether this master treaty is strictly followed in Indian cases and all. But even the recent seminar in Madras School, I raised the same question. But there, Professor Rangarajan himself saying that it is no way connect to the master treaty. It is completely a saving investment formula. So in that way, so 12th Finance Commission has made the justification for that. Why we fixed 3% and 3.3 we debate between center and states and all these things. Now, as you well articulated, the interest payment burden, if you reduce, that will have a positive impact. And but what will be the impact on this proposal on the saving? Because our saving rate is reduced to a large extent. I mean, from 10 to I think around 5, so that range. So will it have any implications of this way of reducing the burden? Thank you.
Hello, Professor Surjit. Thank you. I just need a clarification. I mean, the thing is that no, the fiscal space is also bit constrained by the monetary autonomy, right? So I think maybe the perils of an open economy has a problem on the space itself. I mean, bit clarification if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for a very nice presentation. I mean, and the title actually caught a lot of attention because this is what every state government is currently looking for. Where is the fiscal space for development?
Yeah, everyone.
Yeah. So, and the way you articulated the interest rate issue is quite interesting. The only clarificatory question, since you mentioned that India is on a higher level when compared to other countries or even income groups, could we also see, like you are saying, that India is borrowing mostly from commercial banks and insurance companies at 7% average rate? What is their average interest rate that they have been doing? And why is it that their interest to GDP ratio is kept so low as compared to India? Is it, I mean, then we can make our point quite, strongly, right? Their sources of funds, if we compare with that of India, then we can also say that, look, the other countries are also exploring avenues which are not very interest driven loans. And although it is not the central part of your presentation, since you made this point that India's tax rates are not very low, but tax to GDP revenue is low. So is it then a question of inefficiency? Is that what you are referring to? And if that is the case, then how do we address that inefficiency part?
One point to add is recently the USA and all the revenue and the interest rate is on the high side, no, 5 point something like that. So how do you compare these two now? Because in India it is 7% and in developed countries it's coming to 5 to 5.5.
Interesting. I think, yeah, this particular question which Kiran asked at the end, but that's what I also want to ask because that's slightly different, slightly off the mark. But you made an interesting paradox. I often say that in Kerala, people are rich, government is pauper. Now you are adding something else. Tax rates are high, but the tax. Huh? No, but tax GDP ratio. That's called tax base. That's in the your language. So that's another paradox. Do you have any? You immediately rush into inefficiency. I don't know whether can we do that. I mean, something is an interesting question. In fact, maybe outside, beyond your discussion, that's something like that's something which we have to. There's something a question for us to answer. This is nobody else in this country at this moment of time in this kind of a room. So many will be reflecting on a public finance issue like this. Nowhere, and this is your job to answer this question. Okay, why in Kerala, in India, despite high tax rates, you have a tax base, tax GDP ratio is low. Okay, very nice. I think nobody will be given any more chance to ask question unless you ask now. Okay, right. Please. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for all the questions and comments. I don't know. I don't think I'm competent enough to answer all the questions satisfactorily. But these are all interesting and important point for all of us to ponder what as Sir was saying that we have to. I mean, these are all open questions. I mean, yeah. So let me try to reflect upon at least some of them. to the best of my ability. Uh, Yes. Initially, sir was asking that out-of-pocket expenditure in education and health is extremely high in this. In fact, it is not entirely dependent on public investment, and that's the how the structure is in India. But it has to be like that because government doesn't spend. That is also true. More important, I don't know the causal direction, but I agree, sir, with you that not only our traditional, be it Ayurveda or Amchi or whatever Unani, etc., they were there. Then traditionally we know our food habit, our local medicines. Then some health infrastructure, particularly by missionaries in various part of the country. Not only health, education also, and also madrasas and these that. So there were a lot of religious organizations. They played major role in developing health and educational infrastructure in various part of the country. Those things are there. I
The
mean,
point which I
yes.
was trying to say that when we are trying to compare different cross countries in a place like US in China, completely state. Here, private sector do their
Right.
the so-called HDI, so-called education attainment that you see is not completely a creation of the public.
I agree.
It's also a creation of private. So that should be footnote should be added. That's the
Yes.
point. That's the only point.
Absolutely, sir.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
But you can't, it's not
Hmm.
easy to kind of.
Yeah. So I completely agree with that. However, my concern is that for all practical purposes, 50% of the population in this country is poor.
Okay.
And I was looking at PLFS 2020 to 23 data. According to that, 50% of the workforce in this country earn less than rupees 300 a day on an average. So 9,000 a month on an average. Now, in this kind of a situation, how many people would be able to access private healthcare system or educational system is a concern. Private doesn't mean only Fortis and Apollos, I understand. Even at local, rural, remote places, private people, I have seen doctors who do not take money, they take vegetables. And poor people can offer only that. So that also I have seen. It's not that I myself come from very rural background. So it's not that, but ultimately out of pocket expenditure directly or indirectly goes up as government expenditure in these services comes down. So there is a negative
I
correlation.
think we should not be deliberate. I'm saying that when you compare 1.1% of GSDP
Yes.
with GDP compared with the 3%,
Yes.
can we add 1.1 in the public plus?
When he gave that health
Hmm.
expenditure, it is government's health expenditure.
Government.
So combined, we have 3%.
Combined government.
No. We have a World Bank.
Listen. The point is when you are talking about total expenditure in China, it is government. That is English.
Yes.
When you're comparing that with India, that is you are only giving government.
Government.
There is another part equally important is
Private.
private.
Yes.
Can be added and given compared.
Yeah,
So then
we-
will become compared.
We add it, then it becomes 3%.
No. State plus center.
No. I'm not talking about that.
Yes.
So world development indicators give government expenditure.
Or total expenditure, you
and
are saying.
total health
Yes, right.
expenditure.
Correct.
The total health expenditure is about 3%, 3.5%.
Global average. Then it's not
So-
1%, it's global average.
In India, sir, out of pocket expenditure on an average in health is
Out-of-pocket
around
expenditure
75%.
and spending on health slightly different.
Different, sir. This
Anyway,
is from
okay.
consumption expenditure data.
Fine. Let's go ahead.
Yes.
We-
Yes. Okay, yeah, Ritvik, you were saying, demand constraint situation or production bottlenecks. I think production bottlenecks are important, no doubt about it. And in various sectors, particularly agriculture, of course, there is bottleneck because land is fixed. Given productivity, there is supply side bottleneck. However, at the aggregate level, there could be sector or subsector specific bottlenecks. At the aggregate level, existence of large scale involuntary unemployment and also unutilized capacity in most of the industries. This coexistence of unutilized capacity and unemployment in the longer period, I think points out towards more demand constraint situation rather than a supply constraint situation. So theoretically, I am saying that doesn't mean there cannot be supply side bottlenecks. Of course, they are important. Then yeah, state expenditure in case of Kerala, state expenditure declined and decentralization. That's what I was trying to say. I think that since Kerala state government has started devolving a lot of monies to the local bodies, and they are spending a lot of money on education and health, that should be added up in order to get the true picture. Only state government direct state government expenditure on education and health also might be. In fact, yesterday the finance minister was saying that 49% of the non-plan is going for the salary, going for the teacher salary in the state. And for last 7 months, I think old age pension is due, so that is a cause of concern and all this. Yes. Can we come back? Can I complete
yeah,
this and then? Yes. Okay. Then, yeah, instead of expenditure enhancement, I think quality improvement, you were saying, ma'am. Uh, yeah, I think it's not either or. I think both can be in the social sector gaps are so huge and so wide. And particularly, I mean, those who are middle class, people like us, our children would not drop out, and dropout would happen for the poorer section of population, or we would not die out of starvation or out of without treatment. But those who cannot afford, now for them, of course, quality uh, uh, is important, and quality by quality is very interesting. There's a debate that implementation of technology. Okay, now, technological innovation, many sophisticated techniques are available does not mean they would be automatically implemented always. They would not be implemented under capitalism until and unless they are profitable to implement. So in after East Asian crisis, European crisis, in lot of countries now labor augmented techniques are coming back because labor has become cheaper after the breaking of USSR and all this Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, these countries full of cheaper labor. So quality, there is, of course, I mean, the highest level quality should always be ensured in all, and it is possible. In fact, in Delhi, I can tell you, in all public schools nowadays in West Bengal, I come from West Bengal. Nobody, I mean, if you can afford, nobody sends their children to the government schools. We all studied in government schools. Within one generation, this has happened. But in Delhi, now people are quitting private schools and going into government schools. Maybe a lot of improvement, quality improvement is possible even within government sector, but for that also you need to spend money. I mean, it cannot happen that we would not enhance expenditure at all, and quality enhancement, I mean, entire emphasis should be on quality enhancement. I think it should go hand in hand. There is no either or contradiction. Yes. Mm. Can state government borrow from the RBI? Yes. In fact, I was discussing this with uh, the finance minister, Comrade Balagopal, and the finance secretary, Mr. Agarwal, that whether state governments, I mean, they are going to write to the central government that state government should be allowed to borrow directly from RBI. And if RBI is ready to give them loan, why not? At a much lower interest rate and so on. But I don't think it would be that easy. I think there's a political economy at play. There are interest groups. Obviously, those who are benefiting out of this system, why would they allow the system to change? Yes, I mean, the states can argue. State exchequers are in extremely tight situation. It is true for all the states. And if state exchequer, yesterday also I was arguing, if state exchequer is in tight situation, that means human development gets affected. Human development is primarily state's responsibility. So, I mean, we have to, strengthen state exchequer by somehow, either through larger transfer. If that is not possible, then at least giving these leverages so that government can borrow at a lower rate of interest, maybe from RBI or something, or some window can be created for state government borrowing at a lower rate of interest. I don't know, but state governments can surely try for it. Whether it would happen or not, I don't know. That is a different question. Okay, Ranjit, yeah, 12th Finance Commission, yeah, saving investment balance. Of course, I used to work in 12th Finance Commission, and Professor Rangarajan and D.K. Srivastav on EPW on record, they wrote that 3% idea came from Maastricht Treaty. But at the same time, they have tried to give some justification in Indian context for the 6% thing, 5.5% thing. And that saving investment gap, etc., they tried to. But however, I would like to say, well, I have enormous respect for Professor Rangarajan, but uh, I mean, as far as Professor Rangarajan as a macroeconomist is concerned, he is a monetarist, and he believes that monetarism is true. Yes, and I disagree. Now, I may have my own views, but we had a long conversation regarding these things for quite a lot of times. But uh, yes, they believe that aggregate saving is constant. Aggregate saving S equals S bar. Aggregate saving is not a positive function of aggregate income. If saving can grow along with income and if under a demand constraint situation through demand injection, through expansionary fiscal policy, if your aggregate income rises, then there is no reason to believe that aggregate saving as a positive function of aggregate income would not rise. If that can go up, therefore it is in Keynesian economics or post-Keynesian economics, it is ex post identity. That is, if your aggregate investment plus aggregate consumption plus your aggregate government expenditure increases, then automatically it would generate always in exposed situation equal amount of aggregate saving and aggregate consumption, aggregate tax revenue. No? So that is an identity. It's national income identity. Therefore, now the question is of causality. Some people believe that it is saving which gets mobilized first, then investment takes place, then output grows. But the other school of thought thinks that it is not the other way around, that under capitalism, first investment decisions are taken place, then investment happens, then growth takes place, then saving gets generated. And saving is nothing but income minus consumption, what is not consumed, the unconsumed income. So that way saving gets generated residually. It is not an active variable, it's a passive variable. Okay. But there could be debates and there could be differences of opinion. Yeah. Uh, okay. Yeah. Now, monetary domination versus fiscal domination we were trying to raise probably. If I have understood your question correctly, that monetary policy also constrains through monetary autonomy and so on. Incidentally, I started working with Professor Rangarajan only on this thing. There was one ADB working paper on this fiscal domination versus whether fiscal policy is more free and monetary policy is following, or monetary policy, monetary authority is saying that don't incur too much fiscal deficit, then our autonomy gets hampered and so on. So this is an empirical question, and in the context of India, I think, uh, I mean, it. I mean, there is no reason to believe that monetary authority is intervening too much and telling Ministry of Finance that you cannot overspend. I mean, if there is a lot of overspending, there could be problems. They raise these issues time to time. However, monetary authority is doing something else, which is related to this interest rate. That is, worldwide, there is no empirical evidence that inflation can be reduced by increasing repo rate or increasing the lending rate. But whenever there is an incidence of inflation, this monetary committee authority quite blindly is following Taylor's rule and trying to increase the repo rate through which they try to control. I have a feeling that what they try to control is the deposit rate rather than lending rate, so that to ensure at least non-negative deposit, real deposit rate under inflation. But so it is not inflation targeting policy. It is for safeguarding the interest rate of the depositors. So it is something else. But as a result of which, what happens is cost of borrowing goes up, and that may lead to the cost push inflation. More importantly, it puts pressure on the exchequer because your cost of borrowing for the government is also going up. So I think in India, the rate of interest is quite artificially high, and monetary authority they think that they can reduce inflation by but there is no empirical evidence. There is no, in fact, I myself wrote one paper in EPW where it's one vector autoregression based modeling. So in impulse response function, if you give a positive shock in the interest rate, is not only India, worldwide, but in Indian context also, there is statistically insignificant result that whether positive interest shock can ensure future inflation rates to come down or not. There is no empirical evidence, but I mean they are doing it because I mean there's a belief, and in newspapers everybody, even my mother, tells me sometimes that now probably RBI would raise interest rate because she is interested in her on her savings, on her, yes, yes, yes. Uh, okay. Kiran, yeah, developed countries, how are they managing, etc. Whether they are doing monetization or not. One answer is this rate of interest is much lower there. Second is I look into it. It's very interesting question that you have raised, that what proportion of their fiscal deficit they are monetizing from their own central bank. That has to be looked into. Then we can however, since their interest rate is low, developed country on an average, their debt GDP ratio is more than 120%. Here it is less than 80%. But their interest rate is low. That's why the cost of debt servicing is much lower than us. But what I was trying to show is their effective interest rate is not only lower, it is coming down. And in our case, it is higher and going up. So it's quite something. Mm. Yes, only after COVID or even before that there was a tendency. It's more, right? Maybe, yes. Yes, yes. Yeah, yeah. Worldwide, I'll look into it. It's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. Acha, how to increase tax GDP ratio? Yeah, that I was saying, no, that mainly three broad heads. One is you have to improve the efficiency of tax collecting authority. Here in India, in Europe, they say, Professor Govinda Rao used to say this in an IPFP, that in Europe, people say that paying tax is inevitable as death. But in our country, evading tax is smartness. Because if you don't evade, your friends would give you some suggestions how to, otherwise, when everybody is evading, and if you evade, nothing happens. There's no hardly any punishment. So, people we hear, we read in newspapers that people are evading tax like in hell, but nothing happens to them. And at most they are living in some other country. Yeah, but if you are caught, if there is exemplary punishment, then there will be a threat perception, and then everybody would comply. So that's through improvement in tax collecting efficiency of tax collecting authority. Tax information network is extremely important. Now there is some improvement because of internet technology, and because of I was in the other meeting, Sir was also there, that online meeting, Ashima Goyal and many others. So they were saying that I was suggesting, in fact, Professor Viramani was saying that GST compliance can be improved substantially. In Australia and elsewhere, governments are giving POS machines free. They are distributing, and the chip is with the government, so you can monitor. So some information is there. So by improving information network, even for direct tax, etc., for profit, loss-making companies are nowadays investing in election bonds and so on. But I mean, vis-a-vis profit, etc., more accurate information can be collected, and there is room for improvement, particularly given the technology of information technology, etc. Nowadays, it is possible to a great extent. So that has to be done, in my opinion. And the third thing is how to reduce degree of corruption. Now, corruption is a big question. Nobody is in favor of corruption. Everybody opposes corruption. But in our, which I was hinting at, I think it is privately funded polity. It is not only the big political formation. Even at local level, if you have to become politically active, you need money. Where from the money would come? From profit, from somebody's income, some social security money, something. So we have to be practical about it. It's open secret. Everybody knows, but nobody talks about it because there is no data. However, in such a system, as a social scientist, we have to think that how much is practically possible and how much is not. If our model, if our basic assumptions are unrealistic, then we can't go too far. So it's a social reality, and we have to, I mean, accept that and see. I think the countries where government, where elections are publicly funded, then the tax is being collected possibly. This evaded tax, which is kind of political rent, which also gets collected, comes through exchequer and gets spent in election. And in our kind of a system, probably it bypasses the exchequer, but pretty much the same thing is happening. Yeah, something like that. Then uh, yeah, developed country interest rate is much lower as compared to that. I have already said, yes, developed country interest rates are lower, but in our case, why does it have to be necessarily linked, always linked with the market rate of interest? Particularly when the $600 billion I was talking about, which is more than 20% of our GDP. So it's a huge money. And that is being invested on which the rate of interest is just 2% per annum. So RBI is making 2% per annum, and government is spending on its not only current borrowing, but on past debt, accumulated debt, 80% of GDP, this amount of at 7% per annum every year, so which is more than 5% of GDP, which is huge. So some restructuring can easily be possible in our context, and our effective interest rate on government bond can be reduced substantially. High tax rate, but yeah, ratio is less, compliance, etc. That I have already. So I think yeah, yeah. So compliance improvement is the only. There is another which Professor Chelaya and many others have pointed out in the literature, that our tax base is also low. Our most of our population is poor. Only less than 3% of population pays direct tax in the country. Others don't come under direct taxation. And also, as far as GST or indirect taxes are concerned, I mean, most of our people don't have enough purchasing power. This 9,000 rupees per month income, what do they spend? So our direct and indirect, both tax bases are low. How to improve tax base? That is one interesting question. Many people have suggested that in this country we don't have wealth tax, we don't have property inheritance tax, which are there in the developed country. After a big exemption, maybe up to 10 crore rupees you exempt. After that, for the super rich only, and that would also fetch a lot of money. Then some Piguvian tax on the capital flows, or some pollution tax on the pollution making industries. And there are avenues which people have suggested. I don't know. I am not a tax person, so I can't say how much is feasible, how much is not. But many countries apparently this carbon tax and many other ways they are collecting some more taxes. But compliance can definitely be improved given the tax rates and given the tax base. I believe that still there is room for improving the tax GDP ratio substantially in this country.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to explore the link between, the relation between equality and taxation, because
That is
Scandinavian countries which were more equal, OECD, I mean, they are, I think something which cross-country analysis
right.
may be interesting anyway. Or within country, interstate variation also could be looked into on this tax realization and inequalities. Okay. I hope you have any question?
No,
Okay, fine.
not a
Yeah,
question.
after 5, the room will be closed.
Okay. I was talking about the political institutions regarding the decentralization. I have talked about the decentralization and the government expenditure, right? The political institutions and that kind of a decentralization is needed rather than decentralizing expenditure. That what
We are getting ready for another seminar.
no, just
Very interesting area, I suppose. Very interesting.
Yes, sir.
Interesting area, right, yeah. I think it was generally, I think 1.5 hours, only 3 more minutes left. We are much, much more enlightened than what we were at 3:30. That is undoubtedly. I think for that we have an official lot of thanks. Shall she come over here, please?
Thank you all for coming and raising these questions and making comments. Thank you very much. I've just started working on it, so it will be very useful for.
Good afternoon to all. So I will not extend much. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Dr. K.G. Joseph, Director of Gulat Institute of Finance and Taxation, for chairing this session. And thank you, sir, for your encouragement, motivation, and support to this seminar committee. So on behalf of seminar committee, I would like to thank you. And next, I would like to thank Dr. Surajit Das, Assistant Professor, CESP JNU, for accepting our invitation and visiting GIFT. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, and I think it is very relevant in the current context of 16th Finance Commission, and I'm hoping that the academic community as a whole got benefited from this discussion, and I'm hoping more such interactions, discussions in future too. Thank you on behalf of Seminar Committee and Gulat Institute of Finance and Taxation. I would like to thank you. And then I would like to thank all the participants, both in joined both in online and offline. And your questions, your comments, and interventions is very valuable. And without that, the seminar will not be complete. So I would like to thank all of you, those who actively engaged in it. Thank you. And especially I want to mention those who present here offline from CDS. And we are inviting you in our future discussions too to GIFT. And lastly, I would like to thank all the faculties, administrative staff, research scholars, and technical team and members of the seminar committee. It would not be possible without your cooperation and support. So I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of seminar committee. I would like to thank all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. Right.